The weight of finality. The hospital room was still and sterile, filled with the faint hum of machines and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Ethan Wright sat slumped in a plastic chair, his hands limp at his sides. Across from him, Dr. Halpern was speaking, but Ethan's mind had blurred the words into a distant drone. Only fragments managed to cut through the fog. Stage 4. Metastasize. No curative options. Ethan's heart thudded heavily as he tried to keep his expression blank. The news wasn't entirely surprising. He'd suspected something was wrong for months, but hearing it confirmed was like the final nail in the coffin. The doctor paused, giving Ethan a moment to process, though his tone remained professional, almost rehearsed. "Ethan," the doctor said, his voice softer now, "I know this is difficult to hear. With treatment, we're looking at 6 to 9 months. Without it, perhaps 3. Ethan forced a bitter smile, the corners of his lips barely lifting. 3 months, wah. Guess I should have bought that motorcycle after all. Dr. Halpern smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. If there's anyone you want to notify, or if you'd like help setting up palliative care. I'm good. Ethan cut him off, his tone sharper than intended. No family, no friends, just me. The doctor's brow furrowed, but he didn't press further. After a few more formalities, Ethan left the office, the cool fall air slapping his face as he stepped onto the street. The world outside seemed oblivious to the storm raging inside him. People walked briskly along the sidewalk, bundled in coats and scarves, their faces calm, even happy. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, his footsteps aimless as he wandered downtown. The realization that he was utterly alone, truly and completely, settled over him like a lid blanket. For years, he had told himself it didn't matter. Relationships were messy, people were unreliable, and family was complicated. It had been over a decade since his wife Sarah had left, taking their 2 kids, Claire and Adam, with her. He told himself they were better off without him, a sentiment bolstered by the fact that they had never once tried to reconnect. A bitter laugh escaped his throat as he thought about it. Guess I finally got what I wanted, he muttered to himself. The truth, of course, was much messier. Ethan had always been difficult, angry, stubborn, and often too proud to admit when he was wrong. After his job at the factory downsized, and he started drinking more, the cracks in his marriage had deepened into an unbridgeable chasm. Sarah had begged him to get help, but he hadn't listened. When she walked out the door with their children, he hadn't stopped her. Instead, he had told himself he didn't care. But now, faced with his own mortality, those lies felt paper-thin. He stopped walking when he reached the park. It was quiet, with only a handful of people scattered about. A jogger, a man walking his dog, and a young mother pushing a stroller. Ethan found a bench near the edge of the path and sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He hadn't smoked in years, but today felt like an exception. As he lit the cigarette, his gaze drifted to the woman with the stroller. She looked young, barely in her 20s, her face pale and drawn. She kept glancing at her phone, one hand pushing the stroller absently. Something about her nervous energy unsettled Ethan, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Before he could dwell on it, a sound shattered the quiet, a loud screech of tires followed by a scream. Ethan's head snapped up, his heart lurching as he saw a car barreling toward the woman and her stroller. The driver had lost control, the vehicle skidding across the wet pavement. Time seemed to slow as adrenaline flooded Ethan's system. Without thinking, he leaped from the bench and sprinted toward the woman. "Move," he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. The woman froze, her eyes wide with terror as the car hurtled closer. Ethan pushed his legs harder, his body protesting with every step. When he reached her, he grabbed the stroller and yanked it out of the car's path, his momentum carrying him into the woman and sending them both sprawling onto the grass. The car screeched to a halt just inches from where the stroller had been. For a moment, everything was still. Then the baby's wail pierced the air, followed by the woman's sobs. "Oh my God," she cried, clutching the stroller handle with trembling hands. "Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you." Ethan groaned as he rolled onto his side, pain shooting through his ribs and shoulder. His vision swam, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But then he saw the woman cradling her baby, her face streaked with tears, and a strange sense of calm washed over him. "Is the baby okay?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. The woman looked up, her expression frantic but grateful. Yes, he's fine. You saved us." Ethan managed a weak nod before collapsing onto his back, the world spinning around him. His body ached, his lungs burned, but for the first time in years, he felt something other than bitterness or regret. He felt alive. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, and soon paramedics were swarming the scene. Ethan barely registered their voices as they lifted him onto a stretcher, his mind fixated on one thought. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. A whisper of redemption. The hospital ceiling swam in and out of focus as Ethan blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights. His entire body ached, the kind of deep, grinding pain that left him feeling like a worn-out machine on its last legs. A sharp beep from a heart monitor punctuated the air, the steady rhythm a mocking reminder that for now, he was still alive. "Mr. Wright, can you hear me?" The voice was soft but firm, cutting through the fog in his mind. Ethan turned his head, grimacing at the sharp pain in his neck. A nurse stood beside his bed, her warm, professional smile a stark contrast to his current state. "You're in the hospital," she explained gently. "You were brought in after an accident in the park. Do you remember what happened?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, flashes of the event rushing back. The screech of tires, the woman's scream, the gut-wrenching jolt of impact as the car clipped him. It all came flooding back in vivid detail. He groaned, his voice raspy. "Yeah, I remember. You've got a fractured collarbone, 2 broken ribs, and some nasty bruising, but no internal bleeding," the nurse continued, her tone reassuring. "You're lucky." Ethan snorted, the motion sending a sharp stab of pain through his ribs. "Yeah, lucky." The nurse gave him a look that suggested she didn't appreciate the sarcasm, but she let it slide. "Do you need me to call anyone? Family? Friends?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan considered lying. But the truth was heavier, more solid. "No," he said finally. "There's no one." The nurse hesitated, her expression softening. "Well, if you change your mind, let us know. Someone's been asking about you, though. The woman from the park, Caroline, I think her name was. She's been here since you were brought in. She wanted to make sure you were okay." Ethan frowned, his mind struggling to connect the name to the face. Caroline. The woman with the stroller. He remembered the panic in her eyes, the desperate way she clutched her baby afterward, the tears streaming down her face as she thanked him. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rough. "I'll let her know you're awake," the nurse said with a smile before slipping out of the room. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his thoughts churning. He didn't know why he'd jumped into the path of that car. It wasn't like him to act without thinking. For most of his life, he'd been the kind of man who looked out for himself first and foremost. Yet in that split second, something had shifted. He couldn't explain it, didn't even want to try. But now, lying in this hospital bed, he felt something he hadn't in years, a flicker of purpose. The door creaked open, and Caroline stepped in, cradling her baby in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but when she saw Ethan, relief washed over her like a wave. "You're awake," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank God." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Still kicking?" "Barely." Caroline approached his bed cautiously, her baby nestled against her chest. The child gurgled softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment. I don't know how to thank you," she began, her voice breaking. "You saved my son. You saved both of us." Ethan shrugged, or tried to. The motion sent a sharp jolt of pain through his collarbone, and he winced. "Just did what anyone would have done." "No," Caroline said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "Not anyone. Most people would have frozen or run the other way. But you didn't hesitate. You put yourself in danger for us, and I'll never forget that." Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gratitude. I don't know. It felt like the right thing to do." Caroline hesitated, then placed a hand on the side of the bed. "I don't know anything about you, but I can tell you've got a good heart, even if you don't believe it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. A good heart. The idea felt foreign, almost laughable. But Caroline's sincerity was undeniable, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe it. "I don't know about that," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Before Caroline could respond, the baby let out a soft cry, squirming in her arms. She rocked him gently, her touch soothing. "This is Charlie," she said, her voice soft. "He's only 6 months old, and because of you, he gets to grow up. He gets to have a life." Ethan's chest tightened, though whether it was from his injuries or something deeper, he couldn't tell. He looked at the baby, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep, and felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and an ache he couldn't quite name. Caroline adjusted Charlie in her arms and glanced at Ethan. "I don't mean to pry, but do you have kids?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "I did," he said finally, his voice hollow. "A long time ago." Caroline's brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. Instead, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, if there's anything you need, anything at all, you let me know. You've already done so much for me. I'd like to return the favor." Ethan opened his mouth to dismiss her offer, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded instead, unsure of what else to say. As Caroline left the room, the silence returned, pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the memories her question had stirred, but they came rushing back anyway. Images of his daughter Claire's bright smile, his son Adam's laugh, the sound of Sarah's voice as she begged him to change. He had pushed them all away, convinced he was doing them a favor. But now, lying in this sterile hospital room, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong, and if it wasn't too late to make things right. Echoes of the past. The hospital was unnervingly quiet at night, with only the faint hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' footsteps breaking the silence. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind too restless to allow sleep. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a cruel reminder that time was ticking away, each second slipping through his fingers. The events of the past few days looped endlessly in his mind: the screech of tires, the woman's scream, the impact that sent him sprawling. Every detail played like a film he couldn't stop. Caroline's gratitude had been heartfelt, even overwhelming, but it had awakened something in him that he wasn't ready to face: the echoes of his own family. He shifted uncomfortably, the pain in his ribs sharp but manageable. His fingers brushed against the thin hospital blanket as he reached for his wallet on the bedside table. He hesitated for a moment, then flipped it open, revealing the creased photo he hadn't looked at in years. The picture was faded, the edges worn from years of neglect, but the image was still clear. Sarah sat on a picnic blanket, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, a soft smile on her face. Claire, their eldest, was perched on her lap, her curly hair a wild halo around her chubby cheeks. Adam, the baby then, sat in Ethan's lap, his tiny hands clutching at Ethan's shirt. Ethan's throat tightened as he stared at the photo. It was from a time when life had felt simpler, before the anger and resentment had consumed him, before he had driven them away. He ran a calloused finger over the image, his chest aching with a mix of longing and regret. "Dad," put push me higher." Claire's voice echoed in his mind, a memory so vivid it felt like she was standing beside him. He could almost hear the creak of the swing set, feel the warmth of the sun on his face. But the memory shifted, darkening like a cloud passing over the sun. Sarah's voice replaced Claire's, sharp and filled with frustration. "Ethan, you've got to stop coming home like this. The kids need you. I need you." He had brushed her off, too proud to admit she was right. Instead, he had drowned his guilt in a bottle, ignoring the cracks forming in their family until they had shattered beyond repair. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing the memories back. What good did it do to dwell on the past? It wasn't like he could change anything now. Sarah and the kids were long gone, probably happier without him. They had built a new life, one where his absence was a blessing rather than a loss. But Caroline's words from earlier nagged at him. "It's never too late to try," she had said. "Maybe they'd want to hear from you." He wanted to dismiss her optimism as naive, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the tiny flicker of hope her words had sparked. What if she was right? What if there was a chance, however small, to reconnect with them? Ethan exhaled sharply, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his chest. He placed the photo back in his wallet and closed it with a snap, as if shutting away the memories would silence them. The door to his room creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. Caroline stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers in the other. Her baby, Charlie, was strapped to her chest in a carrier, his soft snores filling the quiet room. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice gentle as she placed the flowers on the windowsill. Ethan shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Caroline nodded knowingly and pulled up a chair beside his bed. She handed him the coffee, which he accepted reluctantly. The warmth seeped into his hands, grounding him slightly. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" she said, her tone kind but direct. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who?" "Your family," Caroline replied, her gaze steady. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I can see it in your eyes. You miss them." Ethan stared into the coffee cup, the swirling steam a convenient distraction. "Doesn't matter," he said gruffly. "They're better off without me." Caroline leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," Ethan snapped, his tone harsher than he intended. He immediately regretted it when he saw the hurt flash across her face. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Caroline interrupted gently, "but I think you're wrong. People aren't as quick to give up on those they love as you think." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know me, Caroline. You don't know what I did." "You're right," she admitted. "I don't. But I know you risked your life to save a stranger and her baby. That says a lot about the kind of person you are." Ethan shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That doesn't erase everything else." "No, it doesn't," Caroline agreed. "But it's a start." Her word hung in the air, a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He looked at her, searching for the right thing to say, but nothing came. Instead, he sipped the coffee, letting the warmth soothe his frayed nerves. After a long silence, Caroline spoke again, her tone softer this time. "You said you have a few months left. Is this really how you want to spend them? Alone, with nothing but regrets?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. He had spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was fine on his own. But now, faced with the end, he wasn't so sure. Caroline stood, adjusting Charlie in the carrier. "Think about it, Ethan," she said gently. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing, but it's worth it." She left the room, her presence lingering long after the door closed behind her. Ethan stared at the flowers on the windowsill, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dull gray sky outside. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, what if it wasn't too late? A step toward the unknown. The days in the hospital began to blend together, marked only by the slow shift of sunlight across the walls and the occasional visit from Caroline. Each moment dragged with an unbearable weight as Ethan wrestled with the demons of his past. Memories of Sarah and the kids haunted him, interspersed with flashes of the accident in the park. Every time Caroline visited, her words dug deeper into the walls Ethan had built around himself. She spoke of second chances, of the importance of trying, even in the face of uncertainty. But for every ounce of hope she offered, Ethan countered with a pound of doubt. On the fourth morning, Ethan sat propped up in bed, the stiffness in his ribs a dull reminder of the price he'd paid to save Caroline and her baby. His breakfast tray sat untouched on the bedside table, the steam from the coffee long since dissipated. He stared at the notepad Caroline had left during her last visit. Its blank pages seemed to mock him, daring him to confront his past. With a sigh, he picked up the notepad and stared at it, his fingers gripping the pen tightly. He had no idea where to start. How do you begin a conversation with the family you abandoned over a decade ago? What words could possibly make up for years of silence? The door opened softly, and Caroline stepped in, as if summoned by his thoughts. She carried her usual warmth with her, a quiet strength that made Ethan both comforted and uncomfortable. "Morning," she said, her voice gentle. Charlie was strapped to her chest, his little head resting against her shoulder. "How are you feeling?" "About the same," Ethan replied gruffly, setting the notepad aside. Caroline glanced at the untouched breakfast tray, her brow furrowing slightly. "You need to eat." Ethan shrugged. "Not much of an appetite." Caroline sighed but didn't push the matter. Instead, she pulled a chair to his bedside and sat down. "Have you thought any more about what we talked about?" Ethan grunted, avoiding her gaze. "Maybe." Caroline tilted her head, studying him with the patience of someone who wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. "Maybe is better than no." He shifted uncomfortably, his ribs protesting the movement. "I don't even know if they'd want to hear from me. What if I make things worse?" Caroline reached over and placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "And what if you don't? What if this is exactly what they've been waiting for?" Ethan looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know how she managed to keep chipping away at his defenses, but she did. With a resigned sigh, he picked up the notepad again and flipped to a blank page. "What do I even say?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Caroline smiled encouragingly. "Start with the truth." Ethan frowned, tapping the pen against the paper. The truth. The truth was messy and painful, filled with regrets he wasn't sure he could put into words. But as he stared at the empty page, something inside him shifted, a flicker of determination he hadn't felt in years. He began to write, his handwriting shaky and uneven. The words came slowly at first, each one pulled from a deep, guarded place. But as he continued, the dam broke, and the thoughts poured out faster than he could keep up. "Sarah, I don't know if you'll even read this, but if you do, I need you to know that I'm sorry. I spent years running from the mistakes I made, convincing myself that you and the kids were better off without me. But the truth is, I was too proud and too scared to admit how badly I'd failed. I don't blame you for leaving. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and the kids, but not a day has gone by that I haven't missed you all. Claire and Adam were my world, and I let my anger and my pride drive them away. I let it drag you away. Now, I'm running out of time. The doctors say I have a few months left, maybe less. I didn't write this to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I just needed to tell you how much I love you and the kids. I always have, even when I didn't show it. If there's any chance at all that I could see you all again, even just once, it would mean everything to me. I understand if you can't, but I had to try. Ethan." When he finished, his hand trembled, the pen slipping from his fingers. He stared at the letter, his chest tight with a mix of fear and relief. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Caroline leaned over, her eyes scanning the page. When she looked up, her expression was soft, filled with a quiet pride. "It's good," she said, her voice steady. "It's honest. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. What if she doesn't reply? Caroline smiled faintly, her hand resting on his. "Then you'll know you tried. That's more than most people can say." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. The thought of sending the letter felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But he handed it to her anyway, his fingers reluctant to let go. "Mail it," he said quietly, "before I change my mind." Caroline took the letter and folded it carefully, tucking it into her bag. "You're braver than you think, Ethan." As she left the room, the silence returned, but it felt different this time. Less suffocating, more hopeful. For the first time in years, Ethan had taken a step toward the unknown. It terrified him, but it also felt like the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. He lay back against the pillows, his body aching, but his mind quieter than it had been in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel completely out of reach. The letter finds its way. The days following the mailing of the letter were a strange limbo for Ethan. He spent most of his time staring out the hospital window, watching the world move on without him. Cars zipped past on the streets below. People hurried to and fro. And the faint hum of life beyond the hospital walls reminded him of all he had left behind. Caroline continued to visit daily, her presence a quiet comfort. She never pressed him about the letter, but Ethan could feel her support in the way she spoke to him, in the gentle encouragement she offered when his doubts crept back. He alternated between moments of cautious hope and waves of crushing regret, his mind spinning endless scenarios of how Sarah might react. What if she didn't read it? What if she tore it up the moment she saw his name? Worse, what if she read it and felt nothing? That last thought gnawed at him the most, but he tried not to let his anxiety consume him. For the first time in years, he had made an effort to fix something, and while the outcome was uncertain, he clung to the knowledge that he had at least tried. Far away, in a small suburban town, Sarah Wright opened her mailbox and froze at the sight of a letter with a name she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her hands trembled as she pulled it from the stack of bills and junk mail. Ethan. Her first instinct was to throw it away. After all these years, what could he possibly have to say? But curiosity, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, stopped her. She stood there on the front porch, the crisp autumn air biting at her skin, and stared at the envelope. Claire stepped outside, her college textbooks tucked under one arm. "Mom, you okay?" Sarah quickly hid the letter behind her back, her face flushing. "I'm fine, honey. Just sorting the mail." Claire tilted her head, studying her mother with the perceptiveness of someone who had grown up watching her navigate storms of emotion. But she didn't press further. "Okay, let me know if you need help with dinner." As Claire disappeared back inside, Sarah turned the letter over in her hands. With a deep breath, she opened it and began to read. The words hit her like a tidal wave, each sentence stirring a mix of emotions she had buried long ago: anger, sadness, longing, and something resembling hope. She read it twice, her eyes lingering on the final line. "If there's any chance at all that I could see you all again, even just once, it would mean everything to me." She sat down on the porch steps, her heart racing. It had been so long since she had heard from Ethan, so long since she had thought about what might have been. The years had not been easy. Raising 2 kids on her own while juggling work and life had been a struggle, but she had built a life for herself and her children. She had moved on, or so she thought. Adam came home later that evening, his high school soccer uniform still damp with sweat. He tossed his bag by the door and flopped onto the couch. "What's for dinner?" Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "Spaghetti," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "Cool," Adam replied, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mother's mind. As she cooked, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the letter. She thought about the man Ethan used to be, the one who could make her laugh until their sides hurt, the one who would cradle their newborn children with awe in his eyes. But that man had been consumed by his own anger, his own demons. The Ethan who had driven her away was someone she barely recognized. But the letter, it was raw, honest. It spoke of regret, of love, and of a desperate attempt to make things right. And the mention of his illness, it hit her harder than she expected. When the kids were in bed, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before her. She reread it, her eyes lingering on the parts where Ethan spoke about the kids. For years, she had convinced herself that she had done the right thing by cutting him out of their lives. But now, she wasn't so sure. Back in the hospital, Ethan was growing restless. The waiting was unbearable, each passing hour a cruel reminder of his dwindling time. He tried to distract himself with the books Caroline brought him, or the puzzles she left on the tray table, but his thoughts always drifted back to the letter. On the 6th day, Caroline arrived with Charlie and Tao, her face brighter than usual. "You've got mail," she announced, holding up an envelope. Ethan's heart stopped. "What?" She handed him the envelope, her smile soft but encouraging. "It's from Sarah." Ethan stared at it, his hands trembling as he took it from her. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to open it. What if it wasn't what he hoped for? What if it was filled with anger, or worse, indifference? "Do you want me to step out?" Caroline asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "No, stay." With a deep breath, he tore the envelope open and unfolded the letter inside. His eyes scanned the page, each word hitting him like a blow to the chest. "Ethan, I wasn't sure if I wanted to respond to this. Seeing your name on an envelope after so many years brought back a flood of memories, most of them painful. But as I read your letter, I realized that there's a part of me that never stopped wondering if you would reach out. The kids are grown now. Claire's in college, and Adam's a junior in high school. They've done well, despite everything. I made sure of it. But your name is still part of their story, even if it's one they don't talk about much. I won't lie to you. It's hard for me to forgive the past, and I'm not sure if I ever will. But I also know that life is too short to hold on to anger forever. If you're serious about wanting to see us again, I'm willing to try. For their sake, and maybe for mine too. Sarah." Ethan's hands shook as he finished reading, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. He looked up at Caroline, his voice cracking. She's willing to see me." Caroline's smile was radiant. "That's amazing, Ethan. I told you it wasn't too late." Ethan nodded, though his emotions were too overwhelming to speak. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to heal. Ethan sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in his hands. His chest felt tight, as though his ribs, still healing from the accident, were squeezing him from the inside. But this tightness wasn't pain. It was something unfamiliar, an emotional weight he wasn't sure how to carry. Sarah had responded, and not with the anger he had feared, nor the cold indifference he had convinced himself he deserved. She had opened a door he never thought would be unlocked, let alone cracked open. Caroline sat quietly, respecting the gravity of the moment. Charlie cooed softly in her lap, his tiny noises grounding Ethan in the present. "What are you going to do?" Caroline finally asked, her voice gentle. Ethan blinked, as though waking from a dream. "Do," he echoed, his voice rough. Caroline tilted her head, her gaze steady. "She's giving you a chance, Ethan. A chance to see her, to see the kids. Are you going to take it?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the letter, the paper crinkling slightly. His mind raced with questions and doubts. What would he say to them? Would Claire and Adam even remember him? Did they resent him for the years he had been absent? Could he make up for a decade of mistakes with a single visit? I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I make things worse?" Caroline leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "Ethan, You've spent years living with regret. This is your chance to let some of that go, to face them, even if it's hard, especially because it's hard. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right, but the fear in his chest was suffocating. Still, he had come this far. He had written the letter, taken the first step. Could he stop now, with the finish line in sight? He looked at Caroline, his eyes weary but resolute. How do I even begin? Caroline's smile was warm, encouraging. One step at a time. Start by writing her back. Let her know you're ready. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind beginning to clear. Yeah, I can do that. That evening, Ethan sat with a notepad in his lap, a pen poised over the blank page. The hospital room was quiet, save for the occasional beep of the monitors. He had no idea where to start, no roadmap for how to navigate this fragile connection. But then he thought of Sarah's letter, of the tentative olive branch she had extended, and the words began to flow. Sarah, thank you for responding. I didn't expect you to, but I hoped you might. I spent so many years telling myself that it was too late to fix things, too late to face the mess I made. But your letter gives me a chance I never thought I'd have. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you and the kids in ways that can't be undone. But if there's even a small part of you that thinks we can talk, if there's a chance I can see Claire and Adam, I want to take it. You don't owe me anything, Sarah. I just want to try. For them, for you, and for me. Ethan. He read the letter twice before folding it carefully and sealing it in an envelope. His hand hovered over the call button for the nurse. But then he stopped. For the first time, he wanted to deliver this next step himself. The next morning, he asked Caroline to help him check out of the hospital. Are you sure you're ready? She asked, concern etched on her face. No, Ethan admitted, his voice steady. But I don't think I ever will be. That's why I have to do it now. With Caroline's help, Ethan was discharged. She drove him to a nearby post office, and together they mailed the letter. The moment it left his hands, a strange mixture of fear and relief washed over him. It was out of his control now, and for once, he was okay with that. Ethan expected the waiting to be unbearable, but something had shifted in him. Instead of replaying all the ways things could go wrong, he allowed himself to imagine what might go right. He pictured Claire's face, older now but still carrying the spark he remembered. He thought of Adam, the boy who used to cling to his leg whenever he came home from work, now nearly grown. And he thought of Sarah, the woman who had once been his anchor, his partner, his everything. Days turned into a week, and Ethan settled into a rhythm of quiet anticipation. Caroline visited often, bringing him meals and checking in on his progress. They didn't talk much about the letter, but the unspoken support between them was enough. Then, one afternoon, the phone in Ethan's hospital room rang. He stared at it for a moment, his heart pounding. When he finally picked up, the voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in over a decade. Ethan. Sarah's voice was cautious, uncertain. Yeah, he croaked, his throat dry. It's me. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotions. I got your letter, she said softly. And I think we should meet. Ethan closed his eyes, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Yeah, he said, his voice trembling. I'd like that. They agreed on a time and place, a park near her home, a neutral ground where they could take the first steps toward reconciliation. As he hung up the phone, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. And for the first time, that felt like enough. A bridge rebuilt. The day of the meeting arrived with a cold, crisp morning that carried a stillness Ethan hadn't felt in years. As he sat in Caroline's car, the hum of the engine seemed to match the rapid beating of his heart. His palms were slick with sweat, and the edges of Sarah's letter were crumpled from how tightly he had clung to it during the ride. Caroline pulled into the parking lot of the small suburban park Sarah had chosen. It was quiet, with only a few scattered families strolling along the paths. A playground sat off to one side, its colorful equipment standing in stark contrast to the muted tones of the season. "You're going to do fine," Caroline said, her voice steady. "Just be yourself, Ethan. Speak from the heart." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The cool air hit his face, grounding him slightly. He glanced at the small path that led deeper into the park, where Sarah had told him they'd meet. "Are you sure you don't want me to wait here?" Caroline asked from the driver's seat. "No," Ethan replied after a moment. "I need to do this on my own." Caroline smiled warmly. "Good luck, Ethan. You've got this." With a deep breath, he turned and started down the path, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. The trees overhead were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. He clutched his coat tightly around him, his breath visible in the chilly air. As he rounded a bend in the path, he saw them. Sarah stood near a wooden bench, her arms crossed over her chest as she gazed out over a small pond. Her auburn hair, now streaked with gray, was tied back in a loose ponytail. Next to her stood Claire, now a young woman with the same determined expression Sarah used to wear. Adam, taller than Ethan had imagined, leaned against a tree, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. The sight of them stole the air from Ethan's lungs. For a moment, he froze, unable to move. The fear he had tried so hard to suppress bubbled up, threatening to consume him. What if this was a mistake? What if they didn't want him here? But then Sarah turned, her eyes locking onto his. Her expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She nudged Claire gently, and the young woman followed her mother's gaze, her face a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. Adam turned as well, his posture stiffening as he sought Ethan. Ethan forced his legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he finally reached them, he stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. "Hi," he managed, his voice rough. Sarah offered a tentative smile. "Hi." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, the weight of the past pressing down on all of them. Ethan glanced at Claire and Adam, his heart aching at how much they had grown. Claire, now in her 20s, had Sarah's sharp features and a quiet strength in her eyes. Adam, taller and leaner than Ethan had imagined, looked both wary and curious, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Sarah. Ethan began, his voice faltering. He cleared his throat, trying again. "I don't even know where to start." "Maybe just start with why you're here," Sarah said gently, her arms still crossed, but her tone softer than he expected. Ethan nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm here because I needed to see you, all of you. I needed to tell you how sorry I am for everything I put you through. I know I can't undo the past, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I couldn't leave this world without trying to make things right." Claire's eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. "You're sick?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. They're giving me a few months, maybe less." Adam shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "So now you want to come back into our lives?" he asked, his tone sharp. "After all these years?" Ethan flinched, the words cutting deep. He couldn't blame Adam for his anger. It was justified. "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I'm not here to take anything. I wanted to see you, to tell you how much I've missed you." Adam looked away, his expression unreadable. Claire stepped closer to her mother, her eyes locked on Ethan. "You hurt her," she said, her voice trembling. "You hurt all of us." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make up for it, if you'll let me." For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've missed a lot, Ethan," she said softly. "Years of their lives. Years of mine. But you're here now. That has to mean something." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "It means everything." Sarah glanced at Claire and Adam, her expression a mixture of hope and hesitation. "What do you think?" she asked them. Claire bit her lip, her gaze shifting between Ethan and her mother. Finally, she nodded. "I think we should try." Adam hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. But then he looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and his shoulders sagged slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "Okay." The relief that washed over Ethan was overwhelming. He felt the tears spill over before he could stop them, and he quickly wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch hesitant but comforting. "Let's take it one step at a time." Ethan nodded, a faint smile breaking through the tears. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect, but he had been given a chance, a bridge back to the family he thought he had lost forever. And for however much time he had left, he would fight to make the most of it. Closing the circle. The path toward reconciliation wasn't smooth. It was messy, filled with unspoken tension, halting conversations, and long stretches of silence. But it was also filled with glimmers of connection, moments where hope broke through the cracks. After their first meeting at the park, Sarah suggested they meet again the following week. This time, they invited Ethan to their home, a modest but warm house tucked into a quiet neighborhood. The invitation felt surreal, like stepping into a life he had once belonged to but now only observed from the outside. When Ethan arrived, he found himself lingering on the front porch, his nerves getting the better of him. It wasn't until Sarah opened the door and gave him a small, encouraging smile that he stepped inside. The house was filled with familiar smells, coffee brewing, the faint scent of cinnamon, and it tugged at memories he thought he had buried. Claire greeted him with a polite but cautious smile, her college textbooks spread across the dining table. Adam gave him a nod, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. The warmth of their home contrasted with the hesitance in the air, but Ethan was grateful to be there, even as a guest on the periphery of their lives. Over the following weeks, the walls between them began to crack. One afternoon, Claire sat with Ethan on the back porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I used to wonder what happened to you," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "I used to think maybe you'd just disappeared, like you didn't care about us." Ethan's chest tightened, guilt washing over him. "I cared," he said quietly. "I cared more than I knew how to handle. I just didn't know how to show it. And when I realized what I'd done, it felt like it was too late." Claire looked at him, her expression unreadable. It wasn't. Adam was harder to reach. He avoided one-on-one conversations, keeping his distance even when they were in the same room. But one evening, as Ethan sat watching an old baseball game on TV, Adam dropped onto the couch beside him, his movements awkward and hesitant. "You still follow baseball?" Adam asked, his tone guarded. Ethan nodded, surprised by the question. "Yeah, I used to take you to games when you were little. You probably don't remember." Adam shrugged, his gaze fixed on the screen. "I remember." The simple acknowledgement felt like a breakthrough. They watched the rest of the game in silence, but the tension between them had eased, if only slightly. Sarah remained the steady force holding the fragile connection together. She didn't let Ethan off the hook easily. There were long conversations about the past, about the pain he had caused and the years he had missed. But there were also moments of quiet understanding, of shared memories that reminded them both of what they had once been. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah and Ethan sat in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. "You've changed," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful. Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowed. Not sure if that's a compliment or a critique. She smiled faintly, her gaze distant. It's just an observation. You're softer, quieter. I think it suits you. Ethan chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sadness. Guess life has a way of humbling you when you let it. Sarah's expression grew serious. I can't promise everything will go back to the way it was. Too much has happened for that. I'm not asking for that, Ethan said quickly. I just want to be here now, however you'll let me. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. That I can do. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself woven back into the fabric of their lives. He helped Claire with her college essays, shared quiet moments watching TV with Adam, and spent hours talking with Sarah about everything and nothing. His health continued to decline. His body grew weaker, the pain more constant, but he didn't let it consume him. Instead, he focused on the time he had on the small victories. A laugh from Claire, a shared joke with Adam, the way Sarah sometimes looked at him with a hint of the warmth she used to. One evening, as spring began to bloom, they all gathered for dinner on the back porch. The table was crowded with dishes, the air filled with laughter, and the faint scent of blooming flowers. For a moment, Ethan let himself forget about the cancer, the pain, the ticking clock. He looked around the table, at Sarah, Claire, and Adam, and felt something he hadn't in years: peace. After dinner, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan pulled Sarah aside. I need to say something, he said, his voice low. She tilted her head, her expression curious but calm. What is it? Thank you, he said simply, for giving me this, for letting me be part of their lives again, even if it's just for a little while. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. It wasn't just for them, Ethan. It was for me too. Ethan passed away a few weeks later, surrounded by the family he had fought to reconnect with. His final days were spent in the warmth of their home, filled with laughter, forgiveness, and love. At the funeral, Claire spoke first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. My dad wasn't perfect, she began, but he taught me something important, that it's never too late to try, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. Adam followed, his voice quieter but no less heartfelt. He came back, he said simply, and that's what matters. As they laid Ethan to rest, Sarah stood with her children, the three of them a united front against the grief. Her heart ached, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Ethan had found his way back to them, even if only for a short time. And in that, there was peace.